Jordan, a tall, muscular black man in his late 20s, knelt on the cold pavement beside a crumpled white SUV, his hands hovering near the unconscious woman lying on the ground. Her blonde hair was matted with blood from a deep cut on her forehead, her pale face smeared with a thin trickle of red. Jordan's hands trembled as he pressed his phone to his ear, still on the line with 911, his voice tight with desperation. "Please, hurry. She's hurt bad. I don't know if she's breathing right." He didn't know who this woman was, only that she needed help. He'd witnessed her car swerving wildly before it had slammed into his own vehicle, and instinct had taken over. As soon as he'd shaken off his shock, he'd rushed to her side, doing everything he could to keep her stable while waiting for help. The sound of screeching tires signaled the arrival of the police, but instead of stopping to assess the situation, the officers jumped out of their cars and approached Jordan with a hardened glare. 3 officers, their hands poised over their belts, closed in around him. "Put your hands where we can see them," one officer barked, his hand resting on his holster. Jordan raised his hands, confusion flashing across his face. "Officer, I'm just trying to help her. She crashed into me. I called 911, but his words were met with icy silence as 2 officers closed in, their eyes fixed on him with a suspicion that sent a chill down his spine. The officer closest to him gave him a hard look before reaching for Jordan's wrists, pulling them roughly behind his back. "Hey, what are you doing?" Jordan stammered, struggling against the cuffs that were now clamping down on his wrists. "I didn't do anything. She crashed into me." The officers didn't respond, their faces set as they forced him to his feet, ignoring his pleas. Jordan's mind raced as he watched paramedics arrive, rushing over to the injured woman, checking her vitals, and quickly placing her on a stretcher. His stomach twisted as he saw her face, pale and motionless, the injury on her forehead stark against her skin. The officers moved him further away, their eyes filled with mistrust. "Sir, you're under arrest for assault," one officer said flatly, his voice tinged with finality. "We've got witnesses who saw a man at the scene, and we have every reason to believe you're responsible." "Assault?" Jordan's voice cracked with disbelief. "I didn't assault anyone. She crashed her car into mine. I was only trying to help her." The officers paid him no mind, their faces impassive as they led him to the squad car. Jordan's heart pounded, panic rising within him as he tried to grasp the gravity of what was happening. No matter what he said, no matter how much he tried to explain, his words seemed invisible, swallowed by the cold suspicion in the eyes of those around him. As they pushed him into the back of the car, Jordan glanced back at the unconscious woman on the stretcher, feeling a strange sense of dread. Little did he know that the woman lying injured and silent was more than just another stranger. She was someone who would change the course of his life forever. Earlier that same morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Jordan's small but tidy apartment. He stood in front of the mirror, meticulously adjusting the collar of his shirt, his face a mix of nervous excitement and anticipation. Today was the day he'd finally meet Rachel's mother, a step that felt as monumental as it was daunting. Jordan had been dating Rachel for nearly a year, and things had been wonderful. Rachel was warm, spirited, and full of life, the kind of person who made every room she entered a little brighter. She often talked about her mother, Mrs. Parker, with a fondness that always made Jordan smile. But he also sensed an undertone of caution, an unspoken hope that this meeting would go smoothly. "Come on, she's going to adore you." Rachel's voice broke through his thoughts, playful and reassuring. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders, peeking over him in the mirror. "You've got nothing to worry about. She's a little particular, but once she sees how amazing you are, she'll fall for you just like I did." Jordan turned to face her, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Particular? Huh?" he teased, raising an eyebrow. "And here I was thinking all I had to do was show up, bring flowers, and flash a charming smile." Rachel laughed, giving him a gentle nudge. "You'll be fine. Just be yourself. My mom's had a rough couple of years since my dad passed, so she's cautious with people. But I've told her so much about you. She's curious, I promise." Jordan took a deep breath, relaxing a little under Rachel's encouragement. "All right," he said, his voice steadier. For you, I'd meet anyone. So, dinner tonight at her place? Yep, 7 p.m. sharp. Rachel grinned, slipping her hand into his. And if you're on your best behavior, maybe you'll even get her famous apple pie. Jordan chuckled, squeezing her hand. Best behavior it is, then. I'll even bring the nicest bouquet I can find. As Rachel left to run some errands, Jordan spent the day preparing himself, envisioning his first conversation with Mrs. Parker, imagining her stern but approving nod as they discussed his work, his interests, and his love for her daughter. He wanted nothing more than to make a good impression, to show her that Rachel had chosen well. But as he left his apartment later that evening, bouquet in hand, he had no idea that the meeting with Rachel's mother would never go as planned, nor that fate would set a series of events in motion that neither he nor Rachel could have ever anticipated. The sun was beginning to set as Jordan drove down the familiar streets toward Rachel's neighborhood, a sense of excitement fluttering in his chest. The bouquet of bright lilies sat neatly on the passenger seat, their vibrant colors a small promise of the positive impression he hoped to make. He checked the time, noting he'd be just on time, maybe a few minutes early, a good start. As he neared an intersection, something caught his attention in his rearview mirror. A white SUV, speeding toward him at an alarming pace, swerving dangerously from side to side. His heart quickened as he watched the vehicle struggle to stay in its lane, nearly clipping the curb before jerking back onto the road. "Whoa, slow down," he murmured to himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He quickly pulled into the right lane, trying to put some distance between himself and the erratic driver. The SUV zoomed past him, its tires squealing, the sound almost a scream against the quiet of the evening. Jordan's eyes narrowed as he watched the SUV speed ahead. The driver appeared distracted, their head occasionally bobbing down, perhaps checking something or reaching for an item. His stomach twisted with unease, but before he could consider pulling over to call for help, the SUV veered sharply to the right, tires skidding wildly. In a split second, Jordan's instincts kicked in as he slammed on his brakes, but it was too late. The SUV spun out of control, careening across the lanes and slamming into the front side of his car with a sickening crunch of metal. The impact sent both vehicles spinning, and Jordan's world became a dizzying blur of sounds and flashes. Tires screeching, glass shattering, metal scraping against pavement. His car skidded to a halt in the middle of the street, the hood crumpled, the windshield splintered with cracks. Dazed, he took a shaky breath, trying to steady himself as he processed what had just happened. His heart hammered, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he blinked, willing himself to stay calm. Then he noticed the SUV, a few yards away, tipped slightly on the curb, the front end smashed in and smoke wafting up from the hood. Jordan felt a pang of fear rise within him. Whoever was in that car was likely injured, possibly even unconscious. He unbuckled his seatbelt, instinctively reaching for his phone as he scrambled out of his car and rushed toward the SUV. He could see her now, a woman slumped over the steering wheel, her head bleeding, her face pale and still. Without a second thought, he dialed 911, shouting for help, his voice tight with urgency as he relayed their location and the severity of the accident. "Please, just get here fast," he urged, his gaze fixed on the injured woman as he knelt down beside her, trying to keep her stable while waiting for help. As he whispered reassurances to her unconscious form, Jordan couldn't have known that this single act of kindness would lead him into a whirlwind of accusations and injustice that would test him in ways he'd never imagined. Jordan's heart pounded as he leaned closer to the woman slumped in the driver's seat of the SUV. Her head was tilted against the steering wheel, a gash on her forehead dripping blood down her face, her skin pale and motionless. His hands shook as he reached for her wrist, checking for a pulse. It was faint but steady, and he let out a small, shaky sigh of relief. "Hang on," he murmured, dialing 911 again, his voice barely steady as he spoke into the phone. "This is an emergency. We need an ambulance. There's been a serious accident on Maplewood Drive. The driver's unconscious and bleeding." He glanced around, spotting his car nearby, its front end crumpled from the collision. The flowers he'd carefully picked out for his meeting with Rachel's mother lay scattered across the passenger seat, crushed under the weight of the impact. But in this moment, nothing else mattered. The woman in the SUV was his only priority. Kneeling beside the open door, Jordan carefully reached for her hand, his voice soft but steady. "Ma'am, if you can hear me, help's on the way. Just hold on a little longer." His mind raced, thinking of every first aid tip he knew, trying to remember anything that could help her until the ambulance arrived. He gently adjusted her position, keeping her head stable, hoping to prevent further injury. But she remained unresponsive, her breathing shallow, her face pale as a ghost. Jordan's concern deepened as he held onto her hand, feeling the weight of her life in his grasp. He had no idea who she was, but a deep sense of responsibility surged through him. Little did he know that this woman he was fighting to keep safe was Mrs. Parker, the very person he'd been hoping to impress that evening. Minutes later, the distant sound of sirens grew louder, and Jordan felt a wave of relief. Help was on the way. He kept his hand on the woman's shoulder, his other hand holding his phone as he waited, murmuring quiet reassurances, hoping she could hear him. But as soon as the police cars pulled up, Jordan's relief was replaced by an unsettling tension. The officers jumped out, eyes immediately locking onto him with a hardened glare. They approached quickly, their posture aggressive and cautious, and Jordan's heart sank as he recognized the suspicion in their eyes. "Step away from the vehicle and put your hands where we can see them," one officer barked, hand hovering over his holster. Jordan, still holding his phone, slowly raised his hands, his eyes wide with confusion. "Officer, please, she's hurt. I called for help. She crashed into my car, and I was just trying to help her." The officer ignored his explanation, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. "Sir, we received a report about this accident. We'll need you to step back." "But I called 911, Jordan protested, holding up his phone as evidence, his voice laced with urgency. "I was trying to get her help." A second officer approached, taking his phone and quickly restraining his wrists with zip-tie cuffs. The cold plastic cut into his skin as they yanked his arms behind his back, their movements mechanical, unfeeling. Jordan winced, panic rising as he tried to reason with them. "Listen to me," he said, his voice tense with desperation. "I didn't cause this. She was driving erratically. I swear I was just trying to help." But his words fell on deaf ears. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions steely as they tightened their grip on him, leading him away from the scene. Jordan could only watch as paramedics rushed to the woman's side, loading her onto a stretcher, their urgent movements confirming the severity of her injuries. As the officers guided him toward the squad car, Jordan's mind raced, overwhelmed by the horror of the situation. No one was listening. His words, his pleas, everything he had done to try to help, none of it mattered. To them, he was just a suspect. And with each passing moment, his world seemed to close in, the nightmare intensifying, with no one to hear his truth. As the clock neared 7:15 p.m., Rachel glanced nervously at her phone, checking for any messages from Jordan. He was usually punctual, and tonight was special. He'd promised he'd arrive on time for their dinner with her mother. She'd even caught a glimpse of his new shirt earlier that day, carefully chosen for the occasion, and she could already imagine the bouquet he'd bring. But as the minutes ticked by, her anxiety grew. She called his phone, listening to each ring with increasing concern, but he didn't pick up. She sent him a quick text, her message half playful, half worried. "Are you lost, Mr. Punctual? We're waiting." The silence stretched on, and a gnawing sense of worry settled in her chest. Just then, her phone buzzed with a new message from a friend who lived nearby. The text was brief, but it made her heart stop. "Hey, there was a bad accident on Maplewood Drive. 2 cars. One of the drivers looked hurt. Be careful if you're heading that way." Rachel's stomach twisted with dread. Maplewood Drive, that was on Jordan's route to her house. She grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, her hands shaking as she dialed his number again. But once more, there was no answer. With her heart pounding, Rachel sped toward the scene, barely registering the blur of familiar streets. She clung to the hope that maybe it wasn't him, maybe it was just a coincidence. But as she approached, she saw the flashing lights, the shattered glass strewn across the road, and the ambulance pulling away with a stretcher inside. Her chest tightened as she parked, her gaze searching frantically for any sign of Jordan. She spotted his car, its front end smashed, the bouquet of flowers crushed in the passenger seat. Her hand flew to her mouth, a mixture of fear and disbelief flooding her senses. She had no idea that this scene held more than just Jordan's accident. Her mother was involved too, though she couldn't yet see the connection that would soon unravel before her eyes. At the hospital, the sterile white walls and beeping machines surrounded Mrs. Parker as she slowly regained consciousness. Her head throbbed with a sharp, pulsing pain, and her vision was hazy, fragments of the accident swirling in her mind like a half-remembered nightmare. A nurse noticed her stirring and quickly alerted the doctor, who approached her bedside with a gentle, reassuring smile. "Mrs. Parker, you were in a car accident. You sustained a head injury, but you're stable now. Try to rest." Mrs. Parker frowned, her mind struggling to piece together what had happened. She recalled flashes, a dark figure leaning over her, an intense voice, a rush of movement before everything had gone black. The memories were fragmented, clouded by confusion, but she felt a strong sense of dread attached to them. Was there someone else?" she murmured, her voice weak, as she tried to recall the figure she'd seen just before she lost consciousness. The doctor nodded, carefully choosing his words. "Yes, another driver was involved, but you're safe now. We're monitoring you closely, and everything seems to be under control." A flash of an image, a tall, dark figure kneeling near her, returned to her mind, and a surge of fear overtook her. She couldn't quite recall his face, but the fragmented memory felt threatening, her mind filling in the blanks with suspicion. Her thoughts twisted, clouded by injury and confusion, and the fractured recollections made her leap to conclusions. The presence of that dark figure became, in her mind, the source of her pain, the reason for her injury. With a mixture of dread and mistrust, she convinced herself that the man she'd seen had caused the accident. In the fog of her injuries and assumptions, she didn't realize that this stranger she was beginning to blame was no stranger at all. It was Jordan, the man her daughter loved, the man she'd been meant to meet that very night. But for now, her hazy memory painted him only as a figure of fear, setting the stage for a misunderstanding that would ignite a firestorm of accusations and heartache. Rachel sped through the hospital doors, her heart pounding and her mind racing with questions. She approached the front desk, barely able to get her words out. "My mother, Mrs. Parker. She was in an accident. Where is she?" The nurse at the desk directed her to the emergency ward, where her mother was being stabilized after surgery to stop the bleeding from her head wound. Rachel rushed to the ward, pushing through her panic as she caught sight of her mother lying motionless in the hospital bed, an oxygen mask on her face and monitors beeping steadily. Rachel's hands shook as she took her mother's hand, whispering, "Mom, it's me. I'm here. Please be okay." Her relief at finding her mother alive was soon overshadowed by the sight of officers standing in the hallway, and there, cuffed and guarded, was Jordan. He looked at her with a mixture of hope and despair, his eyes pleading for understanding. She moved toward him, but an officer blocked her path. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "That's my boyfriend, Jordan. He wouldn't hurt anyone." The officer exchanged a doubtful glance with his partner. "Miss, there was a serious accident, and this man is the suspect. We're following procedure." Rachel's voice rose, her desperation clear. "You're wrong. Jordan would never do anything to hurt her, or anyone. He was probably just trying to help." But the officers remained indifferent, refusing to meet her eyes. Rachel tried to argue, explaining how Jordan had been on his way to meet her mother, but they dismissed her words. "We have statements, and we're doing what we can," one of them replied coldly. Frustrated and helpless, Rachel was torn between the horror of seeing her mother in critical condition and the injustice of Jordan's arrest. She couldn't understand how everything had gone so horribly wrong, but deep down, she knew one thing for certain: Jordan was innocent. Hours later, Mrs. Parker stirred, her eyes fluttering open to find herself surrounded by the sterile white of the hospital room. Her head throbbed, and she winced as she tried to move, the pain bringing back disjointed flashes of memory. Rachel leaned over her, a mix of relief and worry in her voice. Mom, thank goodness. You're awake. You were in an accident. Mrs. Parker's face tightened as she struggled to remember. Flashes of the crash came back to her, along with the image of a dark figure she'd seen before everything went black. In her disoriented state, she clung to that fragment, her mind filling in the blanks with suspicion and fear. There was a man, she murmured, her voice faint but filled with apprehension. I saw him right before. He must have caused it. Rachel's heart sank, her face pale as she realized what her mother was implying. Mom, no, that man was Jordan. He was only trying to help you after the crash. He was there because he loves me. But Mrs. Parker's face hardened, her memories distorted by her injury and her deeply ingrained biases. Rachel, I don't know what you see in him, but he's the reason I'm here. I know it. I saw him, and then everything went dark. Rachel's voice cracked as she tried to hold back tears. Jordan wouldn't have done this, Mom. He was on his way to meet you, to make a good impression. He wouldn't hurt anyone, least of all you. But Mrs. Parker remained firm, her confusion and bias clouding her ability to see the truth. I don't know what he told you, Rachel, but I know what I saw, she insisted, her voice icy. Rachel's heart shattered, torn between defending Jordan and supporting her mother, who now seemed unshakable in her belief that Jordan was to blame. The woman who had once been her source of strength was now her greatest obstacle, and Rachel felt helpless, caught in a storm of accusations and loyalties that threatened to tear apart everything she held dear. In the stark, fluorescent-lit room of the police station, Jordan sat with his hands still cuffed behind his back, his mind racing and his heart heavy. He'd gone over every moment of the accident in his head countless times, trying to piece together how he'd ended up here. Branded a suspect, his intentions twisted by circumstances and assumptions. An officer entered the room, his expression unreadable as he dropped a file onto the table. He took a seat across from Jordan, his gaze scrutinizing, as though he could see guilt just by staring hard enough. Jordan shifted, the cuffs digging into his wrists. Let's get this straight, the officer began, his voice cold. You say this woman just crashed into you, and you were the innocent bystander, is that it? Jordan took a deep breath, doing his best to stay calm. Yes, that's exactly what happened. I was driving to meet my girlfriend, and the SUV, was driving erratically. It hit my car. I swear, I was just trying to help her. The officer leaned back, crossing his arms, clearly unconvinced. Look, we have statements from the scene, and all of them point to you as the only person near her when she was found. Now she's in the hospital with serious injuries, and you're telling me you had nothing to do with it? I was the one who called 911. Jordan protested, his voice breaking with frustration. I stayed by her side until they arrived. She was bleeding and unconscious. I didn't want her to get worse. If I was guilty, why would I call for help? The officer's eyes narrowed, his gaze unmoved by Jordan's plea. You're telling me it's just a coincidence that a man with no connection to her happened to be right there, just as she got hurt? Jordan's face flushed, his patience wearing thin. It's not a coincidence. I'm dating her daughter, Rachel. I was on my way to meet her mom for dinner. I wanted to make a good impression, and then the accident happened. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. Dating her daughter? Huh? He jotted something down, his pen scratching the paper with a dismissive air. Funny how her mother's the one who's hurt, yet somehow you're the victim here. Jordan clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the officer's judgment pressing down on him. Every word he spoke seemed to fall on deaf ears, every attempt to explain twisting further into their narrative of suspicion. Please, he said, his voice quiet but desperate. I don't know what else to say. I was there, and I tried to help. That's it. She crashed into me. I didn't do anything to her. The officer stood, his eyes cold as he looked down at Jordan. We'll see about that, he said, turning on his heel and leaving the room. As the door closed, Jordan was left in the suffocating silence of the interrogation room, his heart pounding as he realized that, despite his innocence, his words held no weight here. Rachel sat in her living room, surrounded by a storm of confusion, anger, and fear. Her boyfriend was being treated as a criminal, and her mother, still in the hospital, was convinced he'd caused the accident. Determined to clear Jordan's name, she called a family lawyer, David Ross, known for his tenacity and dedication. When David answered, she didn't waste a second. "Mr. Ross, it's Rachel Parker. I need your help. My boyfriend, Jordan, is being accused of hurting my mother, but he didn't do it. There was an accident, but it's all wrong." David listened intently as Rachel explained everything: the accident, the accusation, and the suspicions that had clouded the truth. When she finished, David's voice was calm but resolute. "Rachel, we'll need to gather evidence to show what really happened. First, I'll arrange for the police to investigate your mother's driving records and access the SUV's black box data." Rachel breathed a sigh of relief, grateful for David's support. "Thank you, Mr. Ross. I need them to understand that Jordan isn't at fault. My mom, she's had a lot on her mind recently. She was probably rushing." As Rachel continued to speak with David, she recalled her mother's stressful week. Mrs. Parker had been dealing with work pressures and managing some unresolved family issues, and Rachel knew it had weighed on her. That morning, she'd even mentioned running behind schedule and trying to fit too much into her day. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that her mother's stress had played a role in the accident. When she hung up, Rachel felt a surge of determination. She would get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. Jordan was innocent, and she would fight for him, even if it meant facing her mother's anger. Meanwhile, Mrs. Parker lay in her hospital bed, drifting in and out of restless sleep. Her mind was clouded with memories of the accident, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw flashes of that dark figure she believed had caused her pain. Her friends, loyal and protective, had gathered around her, fussing over her every need and keeping her company. As they whispered among themselves, one of them leaned close, her tone hushed but urgent. "Linda, I'm telling you, that man shouldn't be around Rachel. He's no good." Another friend nodded in agreement. "He's an outsider. Rachel deserves better than that. I mean, we don't even know where he came from. He could have all sorts of problems we don't know about." They exchanged knowing glances, their words filled with assumptions and prejudice that ran deeper than the surface. One friend took Mrs. Parker's hand, her voice full of concern. "Linda, you're doing the right thing by pressing charges. That man shouldn't be near Rachel. You have to protect her." The conversations left Mrs. Parker conflicted, her heart torn between her friend's reassurances and the vague sense that something wasn't adding up. But, dazed by the accident and swayed by the influence of those around her, she leaned into their support. The conviction they held that Jordan was a danger to Rachel reassured her that she was doing the right thing by holding him accountable. None of her friends, however, knew about Jordan's connection to Rachel. They were unaware that the outsider they so mistrusted was the very person Rachel had fallen in love with, the man who had shown her nothing but care and loyalty. Unbeknownst to them, their words were building an invisible wall around Mrs. Parker, hardening her resolve against the very person who had only tried to help. Rachel sat on the edge of her bed, her head in her hands, the voices of her mother's friends still ringing in her ears. Their words replayed over and over. "He's no good. Rachel deserves better. You're doing the right thing." Each sentence dug into her, an unrelenting reminder of how alone she felt in defending Jordan. She tried explaining to them, but every attempt was met with skepticism. "He's my boyfriend. He loves me and would never hurt anyone," she had insisted, her voice cracking. But her mother's friends had looked at her as if she were naive, or worse, as if she were betraying her own family by standing up for him. The pressure weighed on her, pulling her in opposite directions. She could either distance herself from Jordan, yielding to her mother's assumptions and accusations, or she could stay by his side, knowing it would likely cost her the closeness she'd once had with her mother. After hours of restless reflection, Rachel felt a surge of clarity. She couldn't turn her back on Jordan, not after everything he was going through, not when she knew the truth. Her heart ached as she imagined the disappointment in her mother's eyes, but her conviction was firm. Jordan was innocent, and he was suffering alone in custody, facing the world's judgment without anyone to defend him. She couldn't be another person to abandon him. With her choice made, Rachel contacted her lawyer again, intensifying her fight to prove Jordan's innocence. But as she prepared to face her mother, She felt the weight of the rift that was forming between them, a painful consequence of her decision that she could only hope would one day be healed. Jordan sat on the hard, cold bench in the holding cell, his wrists aching from the restraints and his spirit weighed down by the crushing reality of his situation. He was surrounded by unfamiliar faces, some hostile, others indifferent, but all cast him the same wary, scrutinizing glances. His every move seemed to attract suspicion, each stare a reminder of the stigma that clung to him here. The officers overseeing him weren't subtle in their prejudice, casting remarks that twisted his stomach. One guard sneered as he passed by, muttering under his breath, "Got yourself in a mess now, didn't you?" Another officer looked him up and down, his gaze filled with mistrust and disdain. Despite his attempts to remain calm, the constant tension gnawed at Jordan's resolve. He thought about how he'd ended up here, how a simple act of kindness had turned into a nightmare he couldn't escape. The memory of kneeling beside Mrs. Parker, trying to help, was so vivid it hurt. And now, that same woman was convinced he'd caused her harm, as if his efforts had meant nothing. In his darker moments, the weight of isolation threatened to crush him. But whenever despair crept in, he forced himself to think of Rachel. The memory of her laughter, her unwavering belief in him, and her voice, assuring him that everything would be okay, kept him grounded. He clung to that glimmer of hope, the knowledge that she was fighting for him on the outside, refusing to believe the lies surrounding him. Jordan knew he was innocent, and although his faith was being tested, he resolved to hold on to that truth. No matter how cold or callous the people around him seemed, he wouldn't allow them to strip away his dignity. He would stand strong, for himself and for Rachel, determined to clear his name and prove that he was more than the prejudice and assumptions cast upon him. Determined to exonerate Jordan, Rachel and her lawyer, David Ross, focused their efforts on one critical piece of evidence: the black box from Mrs. Parker's SUV. David knew that if they could retrieve data showing the car's speed, acceleration, and braking patterns, they might have a chance to prove that the crash was not Jordan's fault, but instead the result of Mrs. Parker's own driving. The police were hesitant at first, but under legal pressure, they agreed to retrieve the data from the SUV's black box. Rachel waited anxiously as David made arrangements, her heart racing with the hope that this might finally reveal the truth. When the results came in, David called Rachel immediately, his voice filled with a sense of cautious optimism. "Rachel, the data shows that the SUV was speeding excessively just before the crash, reaching speeds far above the limit. There's also evidence of erratic acceleration and abrupt swerving right before impact." Rachel felt a mix of relief and sadness. The information was invaluable. It confirmed that Jordan was not at fault, but it also painted a painful picture of her mother's behavior that day. Rachel knew her mother had been dealing with stress and had been rushing to get things done. This evidence only confirmed the urgency that had led her to lose control behind the wheel. "We can use this in court," David continued. "It's strong evidence to support Jordan's innocence. We'll make sure the truth comes out." Rachel thanked him, feeling a new surge of hope. The truth was finally within reach, but she knew that presenting it to her mother would be a far more challenging task. She prepared herself, knowing that this proof might change everything, even if it meant confronting her mother's own role in the tragedy that had upended all their lives. Rachel visited her mother at the hospital, black box data in hand. She tried to approach the subject gently, knowing how stubborn her mother could be, but she also felt the urgency to clear Jordan's name. "Mom," Rachel began, sitting at her bedside, "we finally got the black box data from your SUV. It shows that you were speeding right before the accident. There's evidence you were swerving." Mrs. Parker's face hardened, her eyes narrowing defensively. "What are you saying, Rachel? Are you trying to blame me for this?" "No, Mom," Rachel replied, choosing her words carefully. "I'm just saying that maybe the accident wasn't Jordan's fault. He was trying to help you after the crash. This data shows he wasn't responsible. He was only there because he wanted to make sure you were safe." Mrs. Parker's lips thinned, her expression turning cold. "That doesn't change what I remember. I saw him there. He was hovering over me. I felt it, Rachel." He was responsible. Rachel felt a pang of hurt. She had hoped the evidence would ease her mother's mind, would allow her to see that Jordan had been unfairly blamed. But instead, her mother's denial seemed to deepen, her conviction unwavering despite the facts. "Mom," Rachel said softly, her voice tinged with sadness, "I love you. But I also love Jordan. I need you to try to understand that he's innocent. This data proves it." But Mrs. Parker turned away, her jaw set stubbornly. "I know what I felt, Rachel. I know what I saw. I just can't believe you're taking his side in all of this." Rachel's heart sank. The rift between them, already deepened by the accusation, seemed to widen further. She had tried to bridge it with the truth, but her mother's refusal to accept the facts left her feeling powerless. Torn between her loyalty to her mother and her commitment to Jordan, Rachel could only hope that time would soften her mother's heart, allowing her to see the truth that lay hidden beneath her fear and assumptions. Rachel sat beside her mother's hospital bed, her fingers anxiously twisting the edge of her sweater. She had tried every approach she could think of to help her mother see the truth, to see past her own fear and pride. But every attempt had only met a wall of resistance. She took a deep breath, summoning the courage to confront her mother directly. "Mom," Rachel began, her voice steady but pained, "I need to know why you're so unwilling to even consider that the crash might have been your fault." Mrs. Parker's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening as she avoided Rachel's gaze. "Rachel, I don't know what you want me to say. I know what I felt when I woke up that night. I know what I saw. But, Mom," Rachel pressed, her voice cracking, "the evidence shows that you were speeding and swerving. The black box data confirms it. Why can't you accept that maybe Jordan was only there to help?" Mrs. Parker let out a bitter laugh, her tone cold. "Oh, I see. You're choosing that boy over your own mother? Is that it? You think his word and a piece of data are more important than what I went through?" Rachel's face flushed with hurt, but she kept her voice steady. "It's not about choosing, Mom. It's about what's right. Jordan is innocent, and he's paying for something he didn't do. You're the only one who can help clear his name." Mrs. Parker's expression turned icy, her words laced with resentment. "You think I'm going to let some boy come between us? I raised you, Rachel. I've always wanted what's best for you, and that man, he isn't it. You're so blinded by him that you'd rather take his side than protect your own family." Rachel's heart sank. She felt as though she were being torn in two, caught between her loyalty to her mother and her love for Jordan. But her resolve remained firm. "Jordan is my family, Mom," she said quietly, "and I can't just stand by and watch him be blamed for something he didn't do." Her mother turned away, the silence between them heavy and final. Rachel felt a tear slide down her cheek as she left the room, the rift between them deeper than ever. She could only hope that one day her mother would come to see the truth, but for now, she knew she would have to fight this battle without her support. News of the incident and Mrs. Parker's accusation quickly spread beyond their small community, catching the attention of local media outlets hungry for a sensational story. The headlines were relentless. "Man accused in violent assault of suburban mother," "Young woman's life in jeopardy after alleged attack," and "Dark past of boyfriend suspected in hit and run." The story took on a life of its own, twisted by media narratives that painted Jordan as a dangerous outsider. Despite Rachel and David's best efforts, the story became riddled with implications of racial bias and unfounded assumptions, each article adding more fuel to the fire. Public opinion turned harsh, people eager to assume guilt based on a few biased headlines and incomplete details. Rachel and David fought back, submitting statements to the press and reaching out to journalists in an attempt to set the record straight. Rachel insisted on Jordan's innocence, sharing her perspective and the black box data that confirmed her mother's erratic driving. But the damage was done, and Jordan's reputation was tarnished. With each passing day, Jordan felt the weight of the accusations pressing down on him. His face was now recognizable, his name linked to a story that cast him as a threat. The scrutiny became unbearable, and even people who knew him well seemed to regard him differently, their trust shaken by the barrage of negative coverage. Rachel watched in anguish as Jordan endured the fallout, determined to prove his innocence despite the odds. She knew they were fighting more than just a legal battle. They were up against prejudice, sensationalism, and a system that seemed willing to judge Jordan without hearing his side. But she held on to her resolve, knowing that together, they would face whatever came their way, determined to clear his name and reclaim the truth. Amid the whirlwind of accusations and media attention, a glimmer of hope arrived unexpectedly. David Ross, Rachel's lawyer, received a call from a man named Paul Grayson, who had seen the accident unfold from his driveway. "I think I need to come forward," Paul said, his voice steady. "I saw that SUV speeding down the road, weaving back and forth. It looked out of control before it hit the other car. I didn't know if anyone would need my testimony, but I can't keep quiet knowing that man is being blamed for something he didn't cause." David listened carefully, relief washing over him as Paul recounted what he had witnessed. The pieces matched perfectly with the black box data and Jordan's own account of the accident. This was exactly the break they needed. The following day, Paul gave his formal statement to the police, describing how Mrs. Parker's SUV had barreled down the road at a dangerous speed. He recalled seeing the vehicle swerve erratically before slamming into Jordan's car, and he was clear in his assessment. The SUV had been at fault. With this new witness testimony, the police finally began to reconsider their stance. David presented the statement in court, bolstering Jordan's defense and adding to the mounting evidence of his innocence. The strength of the witness's testimony made it harder for anyone to ignore the truth, and slowly, the walls of doubt surrounding Jordan began to crumble. Rachel felt a wave of hope as she watched David work tirelessly to bring this evidence to light. With every new piece of truth, she felt closer to seeing Jordan free of the accusations that had cast a dark cloud over his life. The truth was inching closer to the surface, and she could feel the grip of despair loosening. As the days passed, Mrs. Parker lay alone in her hospital room, the walls closing in on her as she wrestled with her fragmented memories of the accident. Her head still throbbed from the impact, but with each passing hour, flashes of the crash crept into her mind, unwilling to let her rest. It started with small details, the rush of adrenaline, the blinding blur of lights, the flash of her own hand gripping the steering wheel. She remembered glancing at the clock, realizing she was running late, and pressing down harder on the gas pedal to make up for lost time. Her heart raced as snippets of her own actions flickered through her mind. The sudden swerve, the moment she felt the tires skid, the helpless jolt as the car lost control. She closed her eyes, her chest tightening with the weight of realization. The pieces were falling into place, and for the first time, she began to confront a painful truth. She had been the one driving recklessly that night. She had been the one speeding, the one who had lost control and caused the crash. Shame flooded her as she grappled with the consequences of her actions. The idea of admitting fault terrified her, the humiliation of facing her daughter and the young man she had blamed. She'd clung so tightly to her belief that Jordan was responsible, convinced that he was the threat. And yet, here she was, faced with the undeniable truth that her own choices had led to this tragedy. She took a shuddering breath, her hands trembling as she reached for the call button, summoning a nurse. "Please, I need to speak with my daughter," she whispered, her voice thick with the weight of remorse. She knew that facing the truth would be difficult, but the pain of hiding from it was even greater. She could only hope that Rachel and Jordan might one day find it in their hearts to forgive her. Armed with the new witness statement, the black box data, and Jordan's original 911 call, Rachel's lawyer, David, built a powerful case demonstrating Jordan's innocence. Piece by piece, he connected each bit of evidence, presenting a clear picture that contradicted the accusations against him. The evidence painted Mrs. Parker as the driver responsible for the crash, her recklessness and speed setting the stage for the tragedy that had upended all of their lives. David pushed hard for the charges to be dropped, presenting the evidence in court with precision and conviction. He emphasized that Jordan had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in an unfortunate incident that he had tried to handle with compassion rather than violence. Jordan had stayed, called for help, and did everything possible to save Mrs. Parker, only to be repaid with suspicion and blame. As the evidence piled up, even the police and prosecutors began to waver, realizing the case against Jordan was crumbling. But despite the growing doubt in her original accusation, Mrs. Parker continued to insist on his guilt, her voice a powerful anchor in the case. Her reluctance to admit her mistake complicated matters, influencing those still undecided and reinforcing the media's distorted narrative. In her hospital bed, Mrs. Parker clung to her position, the weight of pride and fear holding her back from facing the full truth. Admitting her fault felt unbearable, and she couldn't bring herself to let go of the belief that had shielded her from her own guilt. But the foundation of her accusation was beginning to crack, and all eyes turned to her, waiting for the moment she would either relent or double down. Unable to bear the strain any longer, Rachel returned to the hospital, her heart heavy and her resolve unwavering. She found her mother sitting up, her face pale but her expression as defiant as ever. Rachel took a deep breath, her voice soft but full of emotion. "Mom," she began, sitting at her bedside, "I need you to listen to me. Really listen." Mrs. Parker's gaze softened slightly, though she remained guarded. "Rachel, I'm only doing what I think is best. I have to protect you." Rachel's voice wavered, her eyes brimming with tears. "But this isn't about protecting me. This is about you refusing to see who Jordan really is. He didn't hurt you, Mom. He was only trying to help you. He's a good man who's done nothing but love me, and now he's suffering because of something that wasn't his fault." Mrs. Parker looked away, her face tightening with discomfort, but Rachel pressed on. "Do you know what this has done to him? To us? Every day, he's had to face people doubting him, questioning his character, all because of a misunderstanding. And it's tearing me apart to watch him go through this. I don't want to lose him, Mom, but I'm afraid this will break us." Her mother's eyes glistened with the beginnings of tears, her lips trembling as Rachel's words struck a chord. She saw the pain and heartbreak in her daughter's eyes, a direct consequence of her own stubbornness. Rachel reached for her mother's hand, her voice a whisper. "Please, Mom, look past your pride. See Jordan for who he is. Think about everything he's endured because of this. He's innocent and you know it." Mrs. Parker closed her eyes, struggling against the swell of emotions Rachel's words had stirred within her. She knew, deep down, that her daughter was right, that Jordan's intentions had been pure, that her own actions had brought them all to this painful place. She could feel her resistance weakening, but the shame of her mistake loomed large, holding her back, leaving her silent and torn. The weight of Rachel's plea lingered in the room, a quiet but powerful reminder of the damage that pride and prejudice could cause. In the quiet of her hospital room, Mrs. Parker lay awake, exhausted from the turmoil that had taken over her life. Her mind drifted back to the accident, the blurred streetlights, the screech of tires, the terror as she'd lost control. But the memories of her actions before the crash were now painfully clear. The speeding, the reckless decisions, the moment her SUV had veered off course. She thought of Jordan kneeling beside her, his face filled with worry as he called for help, and how, in her disoriented state, she'd turned her fear into blame. Her initial reaction had been to protect herself, to find an explanation that didn't require her to face her own mistakes. She realized now that her judgment hadn't just come from fear, but from a prejudice she had refused to acknowledge, a deep-seated distrust that had clouded her perception of Jordan from the start. A wave of shame washed over her as she considered the pain her accusations had inflicted, not only on Jordan but on her own daughter, Rachel, who had bravely stood by him despite the cost. Mrs. Parker finally understood the full weight of her mistake and the devastating consequences of her pride. Her heart ached with the knowledge that she had pushed her daughter away and hurt an innocent man, all because she hadn't been willing to confront her own flaws. For the first time since the accident, she felt a genuine urge to make things right. She knew the path to forgiveness wouldn't be easy, but the need to lift the burden of her own guilt gave her the strength to take that first step. Rachel arrived at the hospital the next day, surprised when her mother asked her to sit down, her eyes unusually soft and filled with a kind of vulnerability Rachel hadn't seen before. Mrs. Parker took a deep breath, reaching for her daughter's hand, her voice trembling. "Rachel, I need to tell you something," she began, tears brimming in her eyes. I was wrong. About everything. About Jordan, the accident, my assumptions, all of it. I let my own fears and pride blind me, and I see now how much hurt I've caused." Rachel's eyes widened, a mix of relief and surprise washing over her. "Mom, I'm going to tell the truth," Mrs. Parker continued, her voice resolute. "I'll formally withdraw the accusations. Jordan deserves his freedom, and he deserves my apology. I know this doesn't fix everything, but it's a start." After a tearful embrace, Mrs. Parker made arrangements to meet with the police and officially retracted her statement, accepting full responsibility for the accident. When the charges against Jordan were dropped, Rachel and Jordan shared a bittersweet moment of relief. The damage had been done, but the truth had finally emerged, and they felt the first stirrings of hope as they looked toward the future. With the charges behind them, Mrs. Parker knew the hardest part still lay ahead, facing Jordan, the man she had wrongfully accused. Summoning her courage, she reached out, asking if he would be willing to meet with her. She knew she didn't deserve his forgiveness, but for Rachel's sake, she wanted to try. When Jordan arrived, he listened quietly as she explained, her voice filled with remorse. "I was wrong about you, Jordan," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I know I caused you pain, and I'll carry that regret with me always. I can only hope you'll forgive me, even if it's only for Rachel." Jordan took a long breath, the memories of his ordeal still fresh, but he saw the sincerity in her eyes. "I don't know if I'll ever forget what happened," he replied honestly, "but I'll forgive you, for Rachel and for myself. We all need to move forward." The three of them began a journey of healing, slowly working to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. Mrs. Parker supported Rachel and Jordan's relationship with a newfound openness, her views transformed by the lessons she'd learned. She vowed to work on herself, acknowledging the biases that had clouded her judgment and hurt the people she cared about. Though the wounds would take time to heal, they found comfort in each other, and Rachel and Jordan's relationship grew stronger than ever. Their bond had been tested, and they emerged with a deepened love and a shared resolve to move forward, choosing truth, forgiveness, and compassion as the foundation of their future.
I hope you enjoyed the story. Please like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Thank you.